Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. Today we'll be talking to Dr. Alan Briskin. He's a co-author of the book, The Power of Collective Wisdom and the Trap of Collective Folly. We're looking forward to him explaining the title and explaining the concept. Before I introduce Dr. Briskin, I want to mention that this particular book is published by Barrett Kohler Publishing, and Steve Persanti, the president, is one who shepherded the book along. In case you missed it, last week's podcast was a visit to Barrett Kohler Publishing, and we had a conversation with Steve. So if you didn't hear it, take a minute to go back and listen to Steve. You'll have a lot of fun getting the pulse of this publishing company that publishes only nonfiction books. And now let me introduce you to Dr. Alan Briskin. He wrote the award-winning book, The Stirring of Soul in the Workplace, and he co-authored another book called Daily Miracles. His work with groups and collectives extends back into the early 1970s. He was part of an international community in Israel, founded on the principles of the communal kibbutz. Dr. Briskin is an educator, and he's contributed to the design of schools based on experiential learning. He was the director of education for the Vermont group home that became the model for deinstitutionalization of confined youth. His interest in alternative educational settings continued for over 10 years when he was the principal consultant to the George Lucas Educational Foundation. He's traveled all over the world giving conferences and talks from Canada to England to South Africa, as well as in the United States. He spent years thinking very deeply and collaborating with hundreds and hundreds of people about the ideas that he shares with us in his book, The Power of Collective Wisdom and the Trap of Collective Folly. We're pleased to have him on the program today. Welcome, Alan. Thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful to be here.
You know, given the topic of collective wisdom, it seems entirely appropriate that you co-wrote the book with three other authors, Sheryl Erickson, John Ott, and Tom Callanan. But what's really remarkable is the book's acknowledgments. You list by name hundreds and hundreds of people who contributed in some way. For example, you thank teachers, guides, thinking partners, colleagues, friends, groups of sustained inquiry, people who endorsed the original book proposal, and so on, those who took surveys. How do these acknowledgments reflect how the book came about and what you're trying to teach in The Power of Collective Wisdom?
I think that's a good point, Janet. I think the book does reflect a lived experience of what we wanted to articulate. The initiative, the Collective Wisdom Initiative, which began almost 10 years before the book before the book was written, happened from an interaction with a program officer from the Fetzer Institute, Tom Callanan, who eventually became co-author with us. And he had just come back from India, where they had helped orchestrate a gathering with the Dalai Lama. And he was very excited and moved by the experience, but also troubled. As much as he saw times when being together in a group seemed to elevate the conversation, there were other times when it felt that people were competitive with each other or disoriented and lowered the level of discourse. And that was the birth of the initiative. He wanted to learn, and he brought Fetzer as a philanthropic organization behind the idea of what makes a difference between when groups come together and elevate the conversation to a higher order, and what happens when they don't, and why. And so that was the initial inquiry. How does magic happen in groups? That was the first question we asked ourselves. And we knew at the same time that we had to put that side by side with when folly and ineffectiveness happens in groups, that these are related aspects of group dynamics.
Let's clarify right up front then what these terms mean. We know what collective and wisdom mean separately, but help us understand them, how you use them together in the context of your book. Maybe you can just complete this sentence. for our listeners, the combined meaning of collective wisdom is best described as
a sense of deep connection within ourselves, with others, with the earth, and with spirit. What distinguishes collective wisdom is that greater notion that together collectively we can evoke what is a spiritual inheritance, that we all have this sense of ourselves in relation to something larger. And just let's break down wisdom and collective for a moment, because we think we understand each term, but I think each term is elusive, and when you put them together, it can be even more elusive. Wisdom has always been a language, going back thousands of years, for how the individual relates to something larger than themselves, whether it's called the cosmos, whether it's called divinity, whether it's called God. How do we understand ourselves as simple elements that are part of such great complexity? Collective is now much more familiar to us because of Wikipedia and Google and the internet, and we understand what it means to be connected. But this is a relatively recent phenomena. 20 years ago, if you used the word collective, people might have thought of Soviet work camps. So collective comes into our vocabulary as a recognition that something happens at a group level that can't happen at the individual level. And when we pay attention not just to the individual or the interpersonal, but to the group and collective, we see a separate qualities come forward.
That leads a little bit into folly, what you're cautioning us against. So maybe you can explain how you define the term folly.
So if wisdom is elevating a group conversation so that we actually are addressing meaning and passion and joy, then folly is the other part. We come together and all those things don't happen. Instead, we polarize our conversations. We accuse each other. We look for blame. We talk past each other. And the result of that is dysfunction. The result of that can be evil. And this is not unfamiliar to those listening, because we're in a time of great polarization and great dysfunction. And we are living out the folly of what happens when people can't really address each other. And I would say beyond just simply communicating with each other, being able to touch into what people really care about, to have conversations that matter and touch the heart and touch our intuition about what's possible.
So right off the bat in the beginning of the book, you tell a story about smoke jumpers and their failure at Man Gulch. And you use this to illustrate the need for such a book. You've given us some really good background on why we need the book. But maybe you can share that story with our listeners and then tell us who your audience is.
Yeah, the Man Gulch story took place in Montana. And it was really the beginning of our study of forest fires and how to combat them. And the failure was that the lead smoke jumper never had a relationship with any of the men he went in with. They had never practiced together. They never got to know each other. They certainly never had personal relationships of who they were and their families. And circumstances occurred out of their control. And the lead smoke jumper intuitively figured out a way to save himself. He created a burned patch that he was able to hide in, and the fire literally was able to sweep around him. But as much as he tried, no one followed him into that burned patch. And all but one or two died as they just scattered in chaos. And the question I asked is, what would prevent something like that? How, during times of crisis, can we actually be connected with each other? And so the intuition of one can be embraced by others. And that takes relationship. That takes some degree of real connection with each other. The opposite of that is what all too many of us face, which is simply transactions, that we don't really care about the person, we just care about the transaction. And during times that become more and more hurried, when pressure is building, when the next quarterly report is coming out, people become more and more irritated with each other, more and more abrupt with each other, and then the failure of communication follows. So that smoke jumper story was a metaphor for we are in times of crisis and instability and volatility, and this is exactly the time when we need to build deeper relationships with each other.
And it sounds like from the examples you just gave, the collective word could mean just two people as well as a whole organization. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's very good, Janet. I think so. In sort of technical terms, a group is, more than two people, three or more. But I think of any kind of relationship as the beginning of a collective. And if we want to say even the individual within themselves are so many different voices. And so there's a collective within each of us that we have to reconcile. And so that the idea of the collective happens at the intrapersonal level as well as the interpersonal and then at the group level.
So it sounds like your audience is anyone who has a relationship with one other person.
That's a large audience, and it's true.
Yeah. Well, let's get into this this idea of collective wisdom. To increase the likelihood of collective wisdom emerging, you propose 6 stances or attitudes, and the first is deep listening. To illustrate this stance, you give an example of a woman known as a clan mother. She comes from the Turtle Clan of the Iroquois Nation. So, as a deep listener, how does she function in this group?
Yeah, it was Paula Underwood. And as you say, she was from the Iroquois nations and clan mother. And she said the clan mother had a particular role, which was listening to the heart of the people. And Sheryl Erickson, my co-author, asked her, how does one do that? And she told the story of her father's influence in her developing this, that he would have her come and listen to people until she could say verbatim what they said. And then one day he said, okay, I know that you can, remember their words, but can you listen to their heart? And she was a little girl, and she was stunned by this idea of listening to their heart. And she literally put her ear to people's chests so that she could listen to their heart. And she began paying attention to the meaning behind what people were saying. And then the feeling and emotional tone of what they were saying. And then he said, well, if you really want to understand people, you're going to have to read between the lines. And he had her read newspaper articles and had discussions with her about what was between the lines, what wasn't being said. And so she began to listen like that, to listen to people's emotions and to listen to the meaning even when they were not saying it. And what we could now say in cognitive psychology is that she was learning empathy. She was learning emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. In other words, she was understanding how to put herself in other people's shoes emotionally, but also beginning to understand how they created their world, how they thought. And with that emotional and cognitive empathy, she could then listen to the hearts of the people.
And I understand that this tribe does things by unity, they have to be of one mind before they make a decision. And beyond that, they have a cultural way of approaching decisions where they make them based on what the impact will be 7 generations in the future. And I think that's not unique to that particular Indian nation. I think that several require that they see into the future that way. So this is part of their culture, but I'm wondering, how do you teach such a skill to a group without a similar culture or history?
Well, I don't think you teach it. I think that every culture has a capacity for wisdom, and one way we could talk about wisdom is that ability to anticipate the future. We could go through various folk tales and myth in Western culture to remind ourselves that this has always been kind of the DNA of wisdom, that we see what's coming. And in order to see what's coming, you have to keep the whole system in mind. You have to have a bigger view than just what do I need today or what do I need to get by for tomorrow. And any culture can lose this capacity, but all human groups that have survived had some element of this. So we're really talking about cultivating something that's already within us, and this idea of 7 generations is both literal and a metaphor. It's asking the question: if we did this, what would that mean for the people and how they would be affected? We see this very clearly with environmental concerns. We began to understand, certainly by the 60s, that the way we burned fossil fuels, the way we managed agriculture, was having consequences to the Earth's climate. And it was then, as it is now, very hard for people to comprehend that, partly because it would mean changing their behavior. And the resistance to that, and the privileged people who could ignore the future for the immediate present, were able to assert their voices. But this is the tension that we are living in. This is why wisdom of this kind is so important, because it reminds us that the criteria for decisions is not just what will happen for the next month or year, but over the next seasons of our lives and our children's lives and our grandchildren's lives. How do we create that criteria and measure ourselves against that criteria?
That's a great nugget. Looking into the future is the beginning of wisdom. That's great. Another stance to help collective wisdom emerge that you propose is seeing whole systems and seeking diverse perspectives. This sounds really good on paper, and I don't think anyone would disagree with that idea. But it's difficult to do in practice. I mean, you think about our political system and how it's operating right now. On the other hand, political debate has been part of our nation's history since its inception. And one of the best examples is the Constitutional Convention. And you actually bring this forward as you are trying to illustrate this stance, and you talk about Benjamin Franklin there. What can we learn from, well, let's just give some background. There at the Constitutional Convention, everybody is hot and tired and bothered. They've been working for weeks and weeks and weeks trying to agree, and they're having a really hard time. So maybe you can pick it up from there and tell us how Benjamin Franklin's perspective helped the convention and what he teaches us about helping collective wisdom emerge.
Well, it's a wonderful historical tale that illustrated the importance of listening to different perspectives and suspending certainty. And I draw from my colleague and friend, Jacob Needleman, who wrote about that Franklin's role in that Constitutional Convention. And what happens is, to the very end, they don't know if they can really find agreement. Matter of fact, many people came without any intention to create a new constitution. They were just going to revise the Articles of Confederation, or as we say today, kick it down the road, kick the can down the road. But what emerged during the time together was that they had a chance for a historical breakthrough, and they were very conscious that this was a historical breakthrough. This was a movement toward democracy and away from despotism. Franklin, who was in his 80s and suffering from gout and could barely speak toward the end, really held the group as a conduit for wisdom. And as they reached and knew that they would have the votes, they also knew that they'd have to go back to their constituencies and make an argument for this new constitution. And so he wanted to try to draw as many people in favor of it as he could. And he gives this extraordinary speech explicitly about the difference between a despotic rule and a democracy is our ability to suspend certainty. I'm going to read Jacob Needleman's words directly about this experience. In his final words to the convention, Franklin chose to articulate the one quality that distinguished democracy from past forms of government. The quality was citizens' ability to reach beyond human fallibility and collective foolishness to find wisdom together. To do this, however, required from each of them a certain humility and suspension of certainty. In other words, and again, these historical examples, mirror what we're going through now. Franklin warned that the movement toward democracy was fragile, and the components that allowed it to exist could be taken apart, and that a return to a despotic rule was a very real possibility because he understood groups so intimately. What democracy was based on is for people to discuss different opinions and perspectives passionately, but with a regard for each other that they could find some kind of common ground, that they could review the facts of the situation and explore how their differences might actually come together to make something stronger.
That regard for each other, that respect for others' opinion, it has been lost to some degree in the public discourse, which is sad. And yet when we listen to your ideas, Alan, and we talk about this, it seems so obvious that we need to return to that. Yet doing it is much more difficult, putting it into practice. So what can motivate us to do these things?
Well, I think I would reframe it that one, it's tremendously practical to do these things. I think that one of the ways we don't do it is we think it's esoteric or we think it's beyond our reach. There's something extremely practical about listening to different perspectives in order to arrive at a better solution. And I'll give a couple examples of that. I work with a man who's originally from Australia, and he had been working as a volunteer in Laos, and he learned of a simple filtration system that could remove the pathogens from the water, and has built an organization called Abundant Water to do just that. But in order to be able to develop this organization from the ground up, what he realized is that he was dealing with a different culture. He was working with support groups in Australia. He was working with networks in Laos. And if he could not listen to the different perspectives, the different cultural assumptions, the different prejudices even, then he could never move forward with this project. It is the most practical thing he has learned. Now 10 years old, the organization is, and becoming a model for bringing indigenous practices to, entrepreneurial practices to these rural areas in Laos so that people could have clean water. In the same way, I work with many Western organizations, and at the very beginning of a project, what I encourage people to do is to describe their vision of success, and particularly to look at the different ways they approach the initiative. That their different perspectives is an essential aspect of creating an initiative that will succeed. And what I remind them is that initiatives that don't succeed usually fail at the beginning for the absence of a clear picture of what people want to do together. Not at the end. The end, there's always many, many reasons why something fails. The failure is mostly at the beginning when people either allow or inhibit the different perspectives about what people want to do together.
Mm-hmm. You've given us some really good ideas of how to champion the best within us as we work with other people. But the other half of your book is about collective folly and the trap of collective folly. So we need to spend a little time on that. Maybe you can define collective folly for us first and then share a modern example of what that is.
Well, as we have been talking about, folly is actually a word that is benign in terms of we all do foolish things, but that left to its own devices, it can become darker and more polarized, and the consequences is a great danger to any democracy, because the tendency of folly being uninhibited is to scapegoat and to attack the most vulnerable members of a group or society. So folly, as we described it in the book, is both a understandable aspect of there's a lot of things that we don't know, and if we don't acknowledge we don't know them, we'll end up doing dumb things. But at its more dangerous, we will become a society intolerant of each other. And so folly obviously is something that matters a great deal now. And the book and our work since, I believe I'd say it's to immunize against the dangers of folly. Paradoxically, by saying we can all think and do foolish things. We don't have to be right at the very beginning. We need to experiment and learn from those experiments and admit where things can improve. So there's a whole attempt of using the idea of folly as a catalyst for personal and organizational growth, because we know we can do dumb things. The danger of experts, as they've evolved in our cultural networks, is that somehow if we follow the experts, even if it fails, we did nothing wrong. And that's about as opposite as advice I would give. That if we give our power away to experts, we will invariably fail. And we have to trust our intuition. We have to trust each other. We have to address the real practical issues that we face in life, and not give away our power and authority to others.
There again, we see that need for humility that was articulated well by Benjamin Franklin. He was among the best statesmen that the new country could find, and they had to be humble. So you name a couple of forms this collective folly takes. The first is separation and fragmentation, which is the not me, not us idea in which group members welcome data that confirms what they already believe or know. And cognitive psychology calls this confirmation bias. This can be really dangerous, as you said. So maybe you can put that in context.
Well, I'll tell a story first. I grew up, my parents were from Eastern Europe, from Lithuania, and I grew up with the stories of Helm, which is a uniquely Jewish fable about a town of fools. One of the stories of how it came about is that foolish souls were being gathered together by an angel to be taken back and mended, when the bag ripped and all of these souls fell into one town, which was the concentrated place of collective foolishness. And the stories of what happened there remind us of our ability to not get to the root of things. So I grew up with this story that the town was concerned about children falling off a cliff, and they got together for 7 days and talked it to the ground. They considered all the different options, but the final one they came up with was to build a hospital at the bottom of the cliff. And I grew up with this idea that people, sometimes even well-intentioned, can really just get backwards with things. And it takes, again, it's a very practical thing to be able to speak the truth in a group with humility, to have strong opinions held lightly, And what I mean by that is it's not always trying to be agreeable with people. It's sometimes speaking the difficult truths, but at the same time indicating that you're not wed to the literal aspect of it, that you're willing to engage, you're willing to hear other truths with the hope that together we may find a larger truth. And so the two movements of folly, one is, as you said, polarization. And this is a defense against the complexity of the challenges we have. In other words, if I can focus all of my thinking about what's wrong with another person's idea, I don't actually have to come up with a better idea. And we really don't have to look any further. We're talking on the cusp of the government shutting down. And I'm not going to try to talk about one group being right or one group being wrong, but more the history that goes back decades in the United States of developing a polarized system in which we really don't have to address the future. We just have to address what we don't like about the other group. So that becomes that polarization, which happens unless it's stopped quite naturally, is part of folly. The other, maybe less acknowledged, is false agreement with each other. That there becomes a social pressure to believe something, and no one is willing to challenge it. And that false agreement allows people to feel comfortable within their own bubble. But again, it's a defense against the true complexity of the challenges we face. So when I'm working with groups, I'm paying attention to both those movements. How is the group polarized in a way that it's unaware or afraid to deal with its real challenges? Or how do they present to me an agreement that is not really held clearly by the members themselves?
I can't think of a better cautionary story than the one you share in detail about the Challenger space shuttle. Will you just tell that briefly and giving our listeners the takeaway that you intend to convey in the book regarding this idea of collective folly?
Yeah, this emerged for me because in the Collective Wisdom Initiative, the initial research we did, we had the opportunity to talk to the engineer who had warned about the Challenger launch, that the temperatures would potentially cause an explosion. And he had brought his data forward, but there was such great pressure for the launch that his words and his data was ignored. But there was a final meeting in which the engineering firm that he represented and NASA officials talked, and they kept asking for proof that they knew for sure that the data supported the risk that they were addressing, and they beat it back and forth until the engineers were exhausted, and they had sort of a group that were moving toward polarizing and moving toward the launch. And what struck me in the story that he told us is at the very end, the NASA official said, well, I think we have agreement to launch. Is there anyone who disputes this consensus? And there was silence. And as we know, the launch went forward and lives were lost. And it struck me, why was there silence? Why, when there was still this attempt to say, do we have any differences among us? And it had to do with the previous 48 hours and the previous 2 weeks, where they had just been beaten down time and again to try to demonstrate that there was risk. And that becomes a fable, unfortunately, a very real story, but a larger metaphor for our times.
Right. That story seems to bring together both confirmation bias and false agreement, because those on the other end of the line at NASA as I remember correctly from the book, they took their own little vote and put the Thiokol engineers on mute while they did that, and then came back collectively and said, well, this is what we think. Does anyone over there disagree? And nobody would say anything at that point. So they decided what they wanted to believe and had that confirmation bias, and then there was a sense of false agreement.
That's right.
Well, some may be listening and feeling really motivated to make changes and to be a catalyst for this, for helping collective wisdom emerge. And yet they may be hesitating because they don't have all the answers, which is part of the whole process, is not having the answers. You tell the story of Cesar Chavez and his little band of grape harvesters who were in a similar situation. What is it that he did that can help us learn about courage to begin seeking collective wisdom?
Yeah, it's a wonderful tale. And it's a story of what the first strike against the growers. There had to be agreement, among the grape field people to move forward, and they didn't quite know how to do it against the obstacles that were put forward. And the one of our colleagues was at the meeting and translating from Spanish to English some of the conversations. And so she told us the story directly. He brought forward a presence and energy that said he didn't know. One of the most frightening things for a leader is to admit they don't know, and often they'll do whatever they can to avoid acknowledging that. And he went against the grain of that, I think, false notion of leadership. And he said he really didn't know what could be done. He just knew that if we could listen to each other, there might be an idea that would help us move forward. And from within the group, an older woman spoke and said, these things are far too complex for me, but as for how to bring people together to talk about this, here's an idea. And she suggested they set up a small prayer service outside the area where the workers were, and that they could be allowed to come out to pray, and that coming together like that, they could talk about what they wanted to do in relation to the strike. But it was his humility and his intent to acknowledge that we don't know. And I think you, Janet, you made the point beautifully. For people who are moved by this and want to do something, is you start from your not knowing. You start from what you want, how you want to make a difference. You start with conversations. You start by what little you know and all the things that you don't know. And that is how you magnetize people to you, because people can acknowledge that they don't know either. And from this sense of not having all the answers, real traction can happen. And so I'm glad you bring this up, because I think that it's not about developing all of these skills right off the bat. It's about wanting to make a difference. And it's about wanting to do it with other people who share that passion.
Well, thank you for helping unpack your book, The Power of Collective Wisdom and the Trap of Collective Folly. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much, Janet.
You've been listening to Dr. Alan Briskin, and you can find a link to his book on our website or in the show notes. If you like what you're hearing, please take a minute to leave a review of the podcast. And as always, you can like our Facebook page and follow us on Instagram and Twitter. We hope we're helping you save time as we curate books that are insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this has been another episode of the Nonfiction for Life podcast. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.